All right, so welcome, Asher. Do you want to start this interview just by introducing yourself and saying a little bit about what it is that you do?
Okay, sure. So my name is Asher Gelbard, and I moved to Mimbres, New Mexico, outside of Silver City in 2006 from Tucson. I was formerly an optical and imaging systems engineer in Tucson and had kind of some sort of an awakening draw to live closer to the land, learn how to live in more harmony with the earth. And I moved with my family back in 2006 to this little off-grid homestead in Mimbres, north of the Mimbres River. We have to drive through the river to get up to our house, and started learning about what it meant to try to live somewhat of a sustainable, regenerative lifestyle. Initially, we thought, oh, off-grid solar power, well, it'll just be an instantly sustainable lifestyle. And that was quite a myth and not at all the case. There was a lot of materials to be brought in and a big learning curve on how to live on a very limited amount of electricity. But it trained me in all sorts of neat ways to learn how to live. We were living on like the equivalent of about $5 a month of electricity initially.
Wow.
And we were supplementing with propane for refrigeration and heating. Anyway, I went through a process of learning how to minimize use of fossil fuels, and maximize passive and active solar contraptions, things that I made to use less and less electricity and or supplemental fossil fuels like propane. For example, we were using our solar system to pump our well water, and half of that water was going to flush our toilets. So we decided to get rid of the flush toilet and use a composting toilet. We've been doing that ever since and love it.
Want to say a little bit more about what exactly that is?
So it's essentially a dry toilet where you use cover material like wood chips to cover each deposit. We also mix in food scraps. There are different ways of doing it, but the simplest are multiple bins. And you use one bin until it's full, and then you let it sit for an entire year while it's composting and degrading. Meanwhile, you're using another bin. When that one's full, you dig out the one that has fully composted and move your toilet back over to that bin. And so you're saving tons of water that you're no longer using electricity to pump. You're minimizing all the wastewater. And then you're creating nutrients out of your own family's human waste and food scraps and stuff like that. And then that compost, once it's cured, is extremely safe. There's no remaining pathogens, safe to go on fruit trees, even in vegetable gardens if done well.
And when you say cured, do you mean that just with time it naturally turns into soil?
Generally, yeah. Ideally, the compost also reaches thermophilic temperatures. It gets hot enough from all the microorganisms in there with the right balance of moisture and ingredients, kind of mixture of high carbon, high nitrogen sources. So that's kind of why we mix in with the human waste, the food scraps, and other green leafy matter and stuff like that, and the wood chips. So anyway, basically, if you have ideal temperatures and moisture, it will compost within a matter of a couple months. But even if it's not ideal, within a year, all the harmful pathogens have been transformed into nutrients that are useful in the landscape.
Mhm.
So that's kind of the rule of thumb we go by. We're not real careful about getting everything perfect for perfect composting conditions, but we give it an entire year, usually at least, to fully break down.
Okay. So you use this compost as an addition to your gardens and fruit trees, you said?
Yep. Yep.
And
Yeah.
what, just as a basic kind of introduction, what does that do for the soil and why is it important?
Well, in the arid Southwest, a lot of people complain that we don't have good soil, and the soil is actually fine. It's just lacking in organic matter and microbial activity. So organic matter in the soil is going to increase the soil's ability to retain and hold moisture and support more and more life. And it's more or less unlimited. The more organic matter we can get in the soil, the more productive it will be. So any form of compost, it's pretty much any natural living material. It can be from woody, leafy matter, food scraps, even from pet waste,
Mhm.
and it could be also from meat or food scraps that are meat. Anything that was once living will get decomposed by soil microorganisms and fungi and break down into organic matter that's beneficial to the soil and to growing things. So if you want to be doing any sort of food production, then taking care of the soil and creating healthy, good soil is usually where you start. So
Yeah.
even before you start growing stuff, starting a compost pile is really important.
Cool. Just to take a little bit of a step back about, conditions in this part of the state, um, how do you deal with the drought as well to provide nutrients for growing food?
Yeah, good question. So we have an interesting climate here where we actually get half of our rain during the summer, usually starting in July. This year it started early in June, middle of June, call it the monsoon season.
Mm-hmm.
And we get pretty regular afternoon thunderstorms. And so we also have a dry season, where we typically get a little rain, but not enough to grow food. And that lasts from pretty much when you start growing in March or April through July. And so in terms of dealing with that, for most food production, you need irrigation during that dry season for fruit trees and for vegetable gardens. For native plants, they are actually designed by nature to withstand that dry season. So that's why we also encourage a lot of native plants,
Definitely.
native pollinators, and even food producing for animals and human consumption native plants. But your vegetable gardens and your fruit trees are going to need supplemental irrigation. And so we get at that from a number of different ways. I mean, there's city water if you're in the city, which can be really expensive for vegetable gardens and fruit gardens.
Mm-hmm.
Then the next best thing is gray water, which is legal and usable in New Mexico up to, I think it's around 400 gallons per day, which is way more than comes out of most people's houses. And one of the premium sources for that is from the laundry machine. It requires you to change your detergent to a detergent that doesn't have any salts or bleach or chlorine in it. But that detergent is available. And so I install laundry to landscape gray water systems, particularly good for fruit trees because The fruit trees don't need to be watered every day, but they do generally need weekly water. So even if you're doing your laundry once or twice a week, some families do it every day, but smaller families do it once or twice a week. It works great for the fruit trees. And you can actually get enough water to supply 100% of the supplemental irrigation demand for, let's say, 5 to 7 fruit trees, generally from a family's laundry machine. And then you can have other sources of gray water from bathroom sink and shower, and sometimes kitchen sink, although that's a little more tricky. And let's see. And then after that, we've got rainwater. And so you can store rainwater from your roof in cisterns to use for supplemental irrigation during the dry season.
Okay.
And then, yeah, so those are kind of the primary methods. And then in addition to that, we can concentrate rainwater through contouring the landscape to catch and hold more than it normally would. We're reducing runoff, increasing infiltration, and that's not going to get you through the dry season, but it will definitely help all the native plants and your existing plants thrive if you're incorporating what we call rainwater harvesting earthworks, or contouring of the landscape to catch, concentrate, and infiltrate
So
the
that
rain
would mean,
when it does rain.
would that mean planting your crops in like a lower elevation or something so that you capture a lot of the runoff, a lot of the water?
Well, we're generally creating basins. So yes, it's a 3-dimensional transformation of the landscape. A lot of landscaping that you see, professional landscaping, they plant stuff up on top of berms. I don't know if you've noticed that,
Yeah.
but that does the opposite of what we're trying to do. So we actually tend to invert that and create basins. Now, we may also use some of the soil that's excavated to create a berm. And particularly if you make that berm on a contour line of equal elevation, it causes the water behind it to spread out and pond and then infiltrate behind this berm. So that's usually done in combination with a basin. So you'll dig out the soil, and then the soil that you've excavated, you can make a berm on the downhill side. And if you do it along a line of contour of equal elevation, then the water pools in the basin and you get a little bit of extra capacity because the berm is holding it back too. And then then that water is always infiltrating into the ground usually within 24 hours. Mm-hmm. But it's in the root zone of these native plants and other plants that you're planting. And the plants don't have to be in the basin. They can actually be on the berm, on the downhill side of the berm, on the uphill side of the berm, depending on what the plant is. Some plants don't like getting their feet wet, so they don't like being where there's going to be ponding standing water for a number of hours. But even like fruit trees, for example, they don't generally like to be right in the basin, but you plant the fruit tree right next to the basin on high ground and its roots will absolutely tap in. Yeah. And we actually have an amazing example of that in Silver City. Although there are some rumors that it might be bulldozed, but there's a Goff Park community orchard that has 16 fruit trees that have all been planted alongside substantial rainwater harvesting basins that catch over 30 to 40,000 gallons from surrounding parking lots and rooftops, infiltrated into the ground. And there are all these fruit trees that are now like big fruit tree, like many inches diameter and producing lots of fruit. And they're tapped into that annual rainwater.
Cool. Well, I want to give the opportunity to explore a little bit what regenerative means to you and just kind of unpack that word a little bit, because I think it's really important in terms of regenerative food system, or regenerative in general. How would you describe that?
Right. Thanks for asking. Yeah. So we've had all these kind of hot, or I don't know what you call them, these words throughout the past couple decades that people have focused on. And back in the day when I first started getting into all of this in the early, around 2005, 2006, the word was sustainability,
Mm-hmm.
right? And eventually sustainability became mainstream, and now pretty much every college and university has a department of sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
And then every time something gets mainstreamed, it seems to get a little bit diluted due to the nature of corporate interests and global interests and things like that. So regenerative is kind of people came up with some other words for sustainability like durability. We have permaculture actually way back starting in the 1970s that was striving for a similar thing. That permaculture is actually a combination of the words permanent and culture. And the idea wasn't that things don't change, but that we're trying to undo the damage that our culture has done to the earth by creating a culture that has the ability to endure, to last, to be sustainable. So, the concept is there in all these words, but then when they become mainstream, they tend to get diluted or co-opted even, and lose some of their original meaning. And regenerative is now also becoming mainstream too. Most people have now heard regenerative agriculture being mentioned in the news and in documentaries and things like that. So, but for me, what regenerative means, there are two primary elements of what makes something regenerative. And I think in terms of regenerative systems, so, a system could be an agricultural system. It could be a living situation like your house as a system, or your homestead as a system. Could be your vehicle, your mode of transportation as a system. And so let me describe the two things for me that make something regenerative. The first is that it improves in quality over time. So most of the things that humans make don't improve in quality over time. They tend to exhibit, they deteriorate. Entropy is a word often used. They as soon as you build something, it starts to decline in longevity, falls apart, breaks, is susceptible to that. But regenerative systems have the opposite quality, that they tend to improve in quality and productivity over time. And then the second quality is that they produce more resources than they consume. Right. So one example of that would be like, and it turns out that there's a spectrum. Like some things are more fully fulfilling those two qualities than others. And I like to give some examples, like a PV solar system, photovoltaic solar system. It does create more resources than it consumes, in that the amount of electricity produced over its lifetime is higher than the amount of energy that went into its manufacture. Some people might want to debate that, but generally that's the case. If a solar system is used, say, for 25 years, it has the capability to produce way more energy than went into its manufacture. But it doesn't last forever, and the components and the panels fail eventually after 20 or 25 years. And some components, like the batteries and the charge controllers and inverters, may not even last that long. So they are they're fulfilling the second quality, but not completely the first.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not really a regenerative system by that definition. Another example would be in terms of modes of transportation. Like your car obviously is not at all regenerative.
Right.
It's falling apart from the moment you buy it and needing all sorts of fuel and maintenance. And it's consuming way more resources than it provides. Although it, this energy gets you around, but it's not producing other benefits. Compare that with a bicycle, and a bicycle does have maintenance. It does, require repair, but you feel really good when you ride it, and it's building it, and it's giving you exercise and giving you a lot of benefits. So in the spectrum of things, that's definitely towards the regenerative side. And then another example would be in the modes of transportation. How about a horse? Yeah. So a horse might, let's ask the question, does it improve in quality over time? Well, one of the neat things about a horse is it has offspring. It can have babies. So, and you can have more horses. So in that way, that's really a pure example of regenerative. It's creating copies somewhat of itself. So that can be ongoing and continuous. And it does take a lot of food to feed a horse, but in just the right conditions, a horse could thrive off of, there are wild horses in the wild that can thrive off of the wild grasses, and they can produce manure that's benefiting the ecosystem. So that's another example of a regenerative system if we're in the realm of modes of transportation.
Thinking about like our food systems a little bit, how would you like to see, like on a larger scale, how would you like to see our food systems become more regenerative? Or maybe just at the scale of New Mexico or in the county, what do you think needs to change for that to happen?
Right, very good question. So yeah, it's a difficult question with our current population, but I think the key is in small scale, individual and community-based agriculture. And I'm very blessed to be experiencing this where I live in Mimbres. Every single one of my neighbors has a garden and is beginning to produce some of their own food. And I think that's really where it all starts. There will be bigger producers, of course, and we need that. But starting on the individual family scale, everyone can be learning how to grow some portion of their own food and get connected to their land and their ecosystem around their house. And all of these things that we've talked about begin to come into play with that. You need to have good soil, you need to have water, and there are lots of ways of doing that and implementing that in a way that is leading us towards more regenerative systems. It's a difficult place that we're in because we've been brought up in a culture that essentially practiced everything in the degenerative way. Like for food, for transportation, for energy, all of it that we've been brought into is negatively impacting the ecosystem and the earth. So everything that we can do to switch that in the opposite direction. It's one of the reasons why the word sustainable isn't really good enough, because if we just maintain the status quo, it doesn't compensate for all the damage that we've done.
Right.
And that's why the regenerative captures better what we're shooting for in our individual homes and properties and lifestyles to move towards regenerative systems.
Right.
And in regenerative systems, there's always generally there's stacking functions. There's the waste products of one system or one component becomes the feedstock or the input to the next thing. And so, instead of our toilet waste getting flushed down the toilet and going to a sewer treatment plant, we can do things like I mentioned with composting human waste, letting that become an input to the soil and to food production, and at the same time minimizing waste of water and maximizing utilization of water and electricity and things like that. And then I think on a larger scale, it's rethinking how we live in terms of the size of our houses and the amount of consumption that we have.